Hello there. Let's talk about something we all use every single second of the day, our senses. Think about it. Right now, your eyes are scanning these words. Your ears might be picking up the gentle hum of a computer or the sound of traffic outside. You can feel the chair you're sitting on and maybe even smell a cup of tea nearby. This constant flow of information from our eyes, ears, skin, nose, mouth is what we call sensory input. Our brains have the incredibly important job of taking all this information, making sense of it, and then helping us react appropriately. This whole process is known as sensory processing or sensory integration, and it's the foundation of how we experience and interact with the world around us. For most of us, this process happens automatically, without a second thought. We don't consciously decide to pull our hand away from a hot stove. Our brain processes the hot signal and makes it happen instantly. We don't have to think hard about how to walk across a bumpy lawn without falling. Our sense of balance and body awareness takes care of it. But for some people, especially many of the children and adults occupational therapists work with, this process doesn't run so smoothly. Their brains might get overwhelmed by sensory information, or they might not get enough of it, which can make everyday life feel confusing, stressful, and incredibly challenging. This is where occupational therapy, or OT, plays a vital role. Now that we know why sensory processing is so important, the next logical question is, how do we figure out what's actually going on with someone's sensory system? We can't just look at a person and know how their brain is interpreting sound or touch. This is where sensory assessments come in. Think of them as our special toolkits. They are structured, evidence-based methods that help us gather specific information about an individual's sensory experiences and behaviors. They give us a way to measure and understand something that can otherwise feel very invisible and subjective, turning guesswork into a more scientific and organized process. These assessments aren't just about finding problems. They're about building a complete picture. They help us identify a person's unique sensory patterns. Does someone actively avoid certain sensations like messy play or loud noises? Messy play, loud noises, we call this sensory avoiding. Or do they seem to need much more sensory input than others? Constantly fidgeting, jumping, or touching things. Fidgeting, jumping, touching things. We might call this sensory seeking. Sensory assessments help us pinpoint these patterns across all the different sensory systems, from the familiar five senses proprioception, our sense of body position vestibular system, our sense of balance and movement. There are a few different types of sensory assessments that OTs use. The most common are standardized questionnaires or caregiver report measures. Standardized questionnaires, caregiver report measures. These are forms filled out by the individual, their parents, or their teachers. They ask a series of questions about how the person responds to various sensory experiences in their everyday life. Does your child get distressed by having their hair cut? Do you prefer to wear soft, loose clothing? These are fantastic for getting a real-world view of how sensory processing impacts daily routines and participation in different environments like homeschool. They help us see the bigger picture of a person's life. The other main type is performance-based assessments. These involve the therapist directly observing the person as they perform a series of specific, structured tasks. Instead of asking about their experiences, we are creating a controlled environment to see their sensory processing skills in action. These tasks are designed to challenge different parts of the sensory system, allowing the therapist to see firsthand how the person plans and executes movements, responds to touch, maintains their balance. This direct observation provides incredibly rich, objective data that complements the information we get from questionnaires, giving us a well-rounded and detailed understanding of our client. In the world of occupational therapy, there are many tools we can use. But when it comes to sensory assessment, two big names often come up: the Sensory Profile, the Sensory Integration and Praxis Tests, or SIPT for short. It's really helpful to think of them as two different kinds of tools for two slightly different jobs. They both give us crucial information about a person's sensory world, but they go about it in very different ways and answer slightly different questions. Getting to know them is a bit like a mechanic learning the difference between a diagnostic computer and a set of wrenches. Both are essential, but you need to know when to use each one. First up, let's talk about the sensory profile. This is one of the most widely used sensory assessment tools, and for good reason. It's a questionnaire, which means it relies on reports from people who know the individual best. Parents, teachers, the person themselves, if they're old enough. The sensory profile is brilliant for painting a broad picture of how a person responds to sensory events in their everyday life. It helps us understand their sensory patterns and preferences. Is this a person who seeks out sensation, avoids it, is sensitive to it, or has low registration and misses it? It's like creating a user manual for that person's sensory system. On the other hand, we have the SIPT. The SIPT is the gold standard, the deep dive investigation into sensory integration. It's not a questionnaire. It's a performance-based test. This means the therapist administers a series of 17 subtests directly with the child. These tests look at everything from how a child processes what they see, what they touch, to how well they can plan and execute a novel movement. This is what we call praxis. The SIPT doesn't just ask if a child has trouble with sensory information. It aims to uncover the underlying neurological reasons why they are having that trouble. It's a much more intensive diagnostic tool. So what's the key difference to remember as a student? The sensory profile tells you what sensory behaviors look like in a person's daily life. It's accessible, relatively quick to use, and gives you a fantastic overview of how sensory processing impacts function at home, at school, and in the community. The SIPT, however, tells you why those behaviors might be happening from a neurobiological perspective. It requires specialized training to administer and interpret, is much more time-consuming, but provides an incredibly detailed analysis of a child's sensory integration abilities. Knowing which tool to reach for depends entirely on the questions you need to answer for your client. Let's zoom in on the sensory profile, created by the brilliant occupational therapist, Dr. Winnie Dunn. Its main purpose is to create a profile, a snapshot of sensory processing in daily life. It's not designed to be a diagnostic tool for a specific condition. Instead, it helps us understand a person's unique way of experiencing the world. The assessment sits on a model with 4 quadrants: sensory seeking, sensory avoiding, sensory sensitivity, low registration. That framework makes confusing behaviors easier to explain and act on. How do you prepare to use it? No complex equipment. Pick the right version and the right respondent. Infant Toddler Sensory Profile. Sensory Profile 2 for children and adolescents. Adolescent Adult Sensory Profile. Give the questionnaire to someone who knows the person well, usually a parent or primary caregiver, often also a teacher for a school perspective. Administering is straightforward, a series of statements rated on a 5-point scale. Options usually range from almost always to almost never. Example: expresses distress when clothes are rubbing against their skin. Example: enjoys swinging or spinning more than other children. The respondent fills the bubble for each statement, user-friendly, about 20 to 30 minutes. After completion, the therapist scores and interprets the results. Scoring tallies sensory categories: auditory, visual, touch, movement, and tallies the 4 sensory quadrants. The final report shows where scores fall compared to a typical population. For example, much more than others in sensory seeking. The reason Leo is constantly on the move is that his nervous system needs a lot of input to stay regulated. Let's find some safe ways to give him that input. Let's walk through using the sensory profile with a practical example. Imagine you are an OT student on placement. You're working with a 6-year-old girl named Maya. Her parents have brought her to OT. She has a lot of difficulty with morning routines. She is a very picky eater and often has big emotional meltdowns after a busy day at school. These are classic triggers for thinking about sensory processing. Your first step, after getting to know Maya and her family, would be to decide that the Sensory Profile 2 is a great tool. It's your starting point for investigation. Your next step is preparation and administration. You would explain to Maya's parents what the questionnaire is, for making sure they understand that it's not a test with right or wrong answers, but a way for them to share their unique insights about Maya. This will help us understand how Maya experiences the world through her senses, which might give us clues about the challenges you're seeing in her daily routines. You would then give them the Child Sensory Profile 2 caregiver questionnaire to fill out at home, where they can think carefully about their answers. You might also, with their permission, send the school companion form to Maya's teacher. Once the completed forms are returned, you move on to scoring. Most versions of the Sensory Profile now offer online scoring, which is fantastic because it does all the maths for you. You simply input the ratings from the paper form into the system. The software then generates a detailed report. This report will include graphs and charts that visually represent Maya's scores. It will show you her scores for each sensory system: touch, movement, and oral sensory processing, and most importantly, how she scores in the 4 key sensory patterns: seeking, avoiding, sensitivity, low registration. This is where the detective work really starts to pay off. The final and most crucial step is interpretation. Let's say Maya's results come back showing a much more than others score for sensory sensitivity and sensory avoiding, especially in the tactile and auditory sections. This is your aha moment. You can now connect the dots. Her difficulty with morning routines might be because the feeling of certain clothes against her skin is genuinely uncomfortable. Tactile sensitivity. Her picky eating might be less about the taste and more about the textures of food in her mouth. Oral sensory sensitivity. Her after-school meltdowns are likely because she's spent all day in a noisy, visually busy classroom, and her sensitive nervous system is completely overwhelmed. You now have a sensory explanation for her behaviors. Now let's switch gears and talk about the Sensory Integration and Praxis Tests, or SIPT. If the sensory profile is like a wide-angle photograph of a person's daily life, the SIPT is like a high-powered microscope looking at the neurological foundations of their sensory processing. Developed by Dr. Jean Ayres, the pioneer of sensory integration theory, the SIPT is designed to be a comprehensive, in-depth diagnostic tool. Its purpose is not just to describe behaviors, but to measure the efficiency with which a child's nervous system processes sensory information and uses it to plan and organize behavior. It's a much more clinical and specific assessment. The SIPT is specifically designed for children aged 4 years to 8 years and 11 months. Its main goal is to identify and understand underlying sensory integration and praxis difficulties. What is praxis? It's a word you'll hear a lot in OT. It refers to the ability to conceive of, plan, and carry out a new and unfamiliar motor action. Think about learning to tie your shoelaces for the first time. That's praxis in action. Phew, we've covered a lot of ground, so let's boil it all down. Sensory processing is a fundamental part of how every single one of us interacts with the world. As an OT student, developing your sensory lens will be one of your greatest superpowers. It helps you understand the why behind your client's behaviors. That leads to more compassionate and effective therapy. Always remember to look beyond the surface. Challenging behavior is often a person's best attempt to cope with a confusing or overwhelming sensory world. When it comes to assessment, remember the key difference between our 2 main tools. Good luck. You're entering an incredibly rewarding field.